I'm Tom Ratliff. I teach Connecticut history, among other things, at CCSU, and I'm sort of an irregular guest here. Irregular in more ways than one, probably. All right, so we're going to talk about how did Connecticut to be the shape it is. Obviously, we know political boundaries change all the time. I know we're all old enough to remember the maps of Europe and the Middle East and Africa changing as new countries emerge or things, you know. So at any rate, so this is our discussion for today. How did we get to look as oddly as we look? And I'm hoping when I click that. Okay, so the first thing we want to look at is why Connecticut settled, who's moving in here. And early on, people are interested in the fur trade, especially the Dutch. There are people coming from Massachusetts looking for civil and religious freedoms. There's lots of people moving into the Connecticut River Valley because it's really good farmland, as we know even today. And there's also people with an economic motive for establishing the colonies, people feeling that they could get rich in the process, which some people did and some people didn't, because as we probably know, history's not fair, right? Yeah, all right. All right, so here are two early maps. They're both from 1614. This is one drawn by Adrian Block. We know Adrian Block was a Dutch navigator. Let me move this way. In 1614, he sailed up the East River through Hell's Gate, and he explored all through here. He explored the Connecticut River, which he called the Fresh River, and he founded Block Island. If you're going to discover something, you should name it for yourself, right? Exactly. Yeah, sure. That same summer, oddly enough, Captain John Smith, who was the English adventurer and explorer, he explored the entire coast, mapped it very carefully, and because it reminded him of England so much, he called it New England. So we have two maps from 400 years ago, similar in some ways, different in others. So, when people in England started thinking about settling in the New World, it was decided that they would create a council in England that would manage the settlement. So they created something called the Council for New England. It was a joint stock company. That meant that people were investors. They were investing money in the company, and that hopefully they'd get a return on their investment, which they probably didn't make too much money on. And New England was defined at this point as extending from the 40th parallel, which is about Philadelphia, up to the 48th parallel, which, as you can see, here's Quebec, right? So that would be an awfully big region to be considered New England. And then from 1620 to 1640, mostly in the 1630s, what we see is because of religious oppression, a lot of the Puritans are leaving England. It's called the Great Puritan Migration. Somewhere, probably around 40,000 people left England. About half of them went to Bermuda and St. Kitts and Barbados. I can't imagine Puritans who wore wool heavy clothing in those warm climates all the time. The other half of them came to New England, most into Massachusetts Bay, and then they spread out. So most of the early people here in Connecticut were coming from Massachusetts Bay. All right, so here are the early settlements here. We know that Plymouth is settled in 1620 by the Pilgrims. There was a Cape Ann settlement here north of Boston. It was really a fishing community that kind of failed. Massachusetts Bay is established in 1629. People from Massachusetts are moving into Connecticut in the 1630s. They're also moving into New Hampshire in the 1630s. And then a few of the religious nuts like Roger Williams, they settled what becomes Rhode Island, right? All right, we know Roger Williams. And yeah, I always know I'm lost when I'm in Providence and I'm driving around the statue of Roger Williams and I have no idea how I got there or where I'm supposed to be, but it happens to me every time I go, so.
And even with the highways, it still happens.
Yeah, it's well, the problem with Providence, and they have the same problem in New London, because you have the harbor, the roads don't go this way or this way. There's roads in New London. You start off, you're going north, and then you're going kind of eastish, and then you're going kind of westish, and then you're going kind of south, and it's, if you know where you're going, it's okay. You just drive along. If you try to think about it in your mind, where am I? It doesn't work. All right, so to understand Connecticut, we have to understand Massachusetts. The charter for the Massachusetts Bay Colony, it set the northern boundary, the Merrimack River, actually 3 miles north of the farthest point of the Merrimack River. The southern boundary would be 3 miles south of the farthest south point of the Charles River, and you can see right here, that's about right where that comes out. It's bounded by Plymouth here, and on the west by the South Sea, which we all know as the Pacific Ocean, because we had no idea how big North America was, or, you know, early on, lots of people hoped it was just kind of an island you could figure out how to get around, because they all really wanted to get to China for the gold and the silver and all of the good stuff there, right? So anyway, so Massachusetts is established along those lines, and when we get our charter is going to say the boundary with Massachusetts. So the argument is going to be, where's that boundary supposed to be? All right, so the original settlers in Hartford in 1632, the Dutch create a fort at Hartford, right where the Park River comes in. They called it the Little River. And the Dutch were engaged in the fur trade, as they were over here at Fort Orange, which is Albany, right, and down here at what they called New Amsterdam, and they're also trading down in the area around Delaware. So they're interested primarily in fur trade. Along those same lines, the Pilgrims, that same year, they established a trading post at Windsor, which annoyed the Dutch greatly. The Dutch tried to drive them out, but there were only about 14 Dutch soldiers, and there were about 20 men at the Pilgrim settlement, so the Dutch kind of, well, they didn't even bother, right? So, at any rate, so then we see the river towns, Hartford, Windsor, and Wethersfield. These are settled by Thomas Hooker and others. They're coming in out of Massachusetts. They have permission from Massachusetts to come settle, but Massachusetts didn't have the right to give those people the right to come settle. The people in Massachusetts had a right to their territory and their governance and their laws, and they couldn't do anything else. So the river towns are kind of not legal in terms of the English standards, right? Along the coast, there was something called the Warwick Patent, which we'll get to on the next slide, and that supposedly legitimized a settlement along there. So the Warwick Patent. This is the Earl of Warwick. He was the head of the Council for New England, and he supposedly got permission from the king. And there's a lot of historians think he kind of made this up, but there is a patent somewhere, and it's handwritten and it's hard to read. That he had this permission to settle along the coast of what became Long Island Sound. What it said is there was permission to settle from Narragansett Bay, right, which is Rhode Island, again, all the way to the South Sea, because nobody knew where the heck that was, right? In 1628, he supposedly transferred it to two of his friends. One was Lord Say and Sell, and the other was Lord Brooke. Can we guess which colony they helped to establish? Certainly, yes, okay. All right, so the river towns, we have Hartford, Windsor, Wethersfield, and Springfield. And again, because nobody really knew where the line was supposed to be, and Springfield isn't that far over the line, it was assumed that this is just another one of those Connecticut river towns. And when Hartford, Windsor, and Wethersfield decided to get together and create a civil government, they invited the people in Springfield to come along, and the people in Springfield pretty much told them to go pound sand. They weren't interested, largely because by this time, the fur trade was moving north. As Connecticut gets furred out, the farther north you are, the better access you have to the fur trade. So the people in Springfield, all they wanted to do was trade with the Native Americans up here and get rich, which they did. And eventually the founders moved back to England. So Springfield early on, even though they kind of could have been in this, they were not interested. So here are river towns, and for a long time when we talk about Connecticut, what we really mean is Hartford, Windsor, and Wethersfield, just these three towns here. And then in 1635, Saybrook is settled. This gives us a good example of all colonial towns were, we think of Saybrook as right here. All colonial towns, they extended about 14 miles inland. The standard was about as far as a person could walk in a day. Nobody walked through the swamps and the bears and the snakes and mosquitoes and all that. They just kind of figured, it's about 14 miles. So, and they're also both sides of the river. So Saybrook here actually was this would, Saybrook, and this would be Westbrook and Essex and Lyme and all of that stuff. And that's true of Hartford and all the other towns as well. So at any rate, so Saybrook is established under the Warwick Patent. People from Massachusetts are actually coming in, as well as people from England, and they consider themselves a separate colony. Now, the English Civil War starts in 1640s, and it's the Puritans against King Charles I, and a lot of the Puritans, especially the influential Puritans, went back to England to fight in the Civil War. Lord Fenwick, who had helped to establish Saybrook, he left, and he actually sold his colony to the river towns. So after 1642, when we talk about Connecticut, we're talking about the Connecticut river towns. All right, I feel like there's one more there. Okay, all right. New Haven. New Haven is settled by a whole congregation, really. There are people in England, they would like to leave and come to the New World and establish a separate colony. They want it to be an economic powerhouse. They'd like it to be like a modern-day city-state. They're looking to establish a trading colony, and they want a good deep water port. And the best deep water port on Long Island Sound is here in New London. And they weren't sure, because there was some confusion about the boundaries, and because the Rhode Islanders tended to be the religious heretics, like Roger Williams. Roger Williams was that crazy guy. He thought God loved everyone equally. Yeah, which is, back then everybody thought that can't possibly be right. So anyway, so the New Haven, they didn't want to get caught up here and find out they lived in Rhode Island and had to deal with these religious nuts. So they took the second best harbor, which is New Haven. So they settle here. There's a large group of them that come in 1638, and rather quickly they spread out. So we're going to see Guilford and Milford and Stamford, and you can't see it because this little helpful sign is here, South Hold Long Island, because for a very long time, lots of people in Connecticut thought Long Island must be ours. So New Haven is this set of colonies, and they consider themselves separate from Connecticut. And till the 1660s, when you talk about the colonies, you talk about Connecticut and New Haven as being separate. All right, then New London. After the Pequot War, Pequots occupied this area. In 1646, New London is settled by people from Massachusetts who are hoping to claim the territory and establish their own colony. One of the people is John Winthrop. He's the son of John Winthrop. John Winthrop, the city on the hill guy, Massachusetts Bay Colony. So John Winthrop is hoping to create a rather large colony. He was hoping to extend it into Rhode Island, maybe as far as Narragansett Bay. He was hoping to extend it up as far as he could into the Mohegan Indians were here, and he was hoping to extend up to their territory. And he was also hoping to take as much of Long Island as possible. So he had this vision that his colony would be here, and again, separate. So you can see, as of about 1650, when we talk about Connecticut, we have all these different groups of people. They have different religious ideas. They have different political motives. they have certain commonalities. In the 1640s, for example, they all joined together in this loose confederation against the Native Americans because of their concerns for their safety. But even there, the Confederation failed miserably because no one could agree on who was in charge and who should make the rules, which is kind of the way government works, right? Sort of, okay. All right. So, people here in Connecticut were looking at beyond the borders of what we think of today as our Connecticut's, what, 5,000 square miles or so. So lots of both New Haven and New London people are looking at Long Island. There are actually Connecticut people that settle on Long Island. There are lots of people looking towards Rhode Island because Rhode Island was undefined, right? Especially John Winthrop Jr. We're also looking towards New York, and in 1664 the British take New York from the Dutch, and with the help of a lot of Connecticut militiamen, and we here in Connecticut thought, hey, that must be our land anyway, because so there was this idea that somehow we were going to get something out of it, which we didn't. Right? So the whole question is, how far west are we going to be able to extend? And that's going to bring us to the charter. In 1662, here's Charles II. In 1660, Parliament asked Charles II to come back and be the King of England, and which he did, but the problem for a lot of the Puritans, especially here in Connecticut, is that the Puritans had fought against Charles's father. Charles I had been beheaded by the Puritans. Right? When Charles comes back, the Parliament says, if we let you come back and be king, how mad would you be at everybody? Who would you want to get even with? And all he wanted to do was get revenge on what he called the regicides, the people that had signed his father's death warrant. Now, there were about 50 judges that had signed it, right? He actually only went after a few. There were a couple that were hanged. Some of them actually escaped to New Haven Colony. At any rate, so when he becomes the king, all of us here in Connecticut, we're thinking, we don't really have a legal charter. People from New York, from Massachusetts said, yeah, it's okay to settle there. They didn't have a legal right to do that. The Warwick Patent may or may not have been legal. So there's a lot of concern that what we need to do is go hat in hand, very politely, probably with a nice little bag of gold, just to say, here's a little gift for you. How'd you like to give us a charter? So in 1662, that's what happens. And we're issued this charter. This is a lovely, see, I used to think I was a kid, I saw the C that it was Connecticut, and then I realized that's Charles right there. So, have we seen the charter? It's in Hartford, in the Connecticut.
The one they put in the tree, is that the charter?
Eventually, yes.
Oak.
Charter Oak, yes. Do we know the State Library?
Yeah, behind the Capitol.
Yeah, so you got the building. It's the State Library on one side. It's the State Court on the other side. In the middle, there's a small. It's about the size of this room. It's a museum. It's the Connecticut History Museum, and in the very back wall is the charter. There's this big giant safe that they close every night to protect it, and it's protected by plexiglass, but you can actually see it's the real charter from 1662. Now, it's written on big sheets of paper, and there's 3 of them. So when you walk in, you're looking at it, and you're thinking, like, where the heck did they get a piece of paper that big? And if you look closely, you can see the lines. It's still pretty large. Anyway, so this is the charter that we got in 1662 from Charles. And our borders are defined thusly. Our northern border is the border with Massachusetts. Nobody knows where that's supposed to be. On the south, it's Long Island Sound. What that means is that the people living in New Haven and New London, whether they like it or not, are now part of Connecticut, and the people in New Haven didn't like it. On the east is Narragansett Bay, which would mean that Rhode Island would be, about 12 feet wide, or it would be very small. And of course, on the west, it was the South Sea, because nobody knew where the Pacific Ocean was. So that would mean Connecticut has this really odd shape, right? So at any rate, this adds New Haven, and the people in New Haven were really unhappy. So the other New Haven towns, Stamford and Guilford and Milford, they all said, we'll join with Connecticut, that's okay. The people in New Haven said, not on your life. Now in the meantime, New York had been given to, Charles had given New Amsterdam to his brother James, who was the Duke of York, which is why we call it New York, and James, who was an Episcopalian, Church of England, he said, that's okay, if New Haven doesn't want to be part of Connecticut, they can be part of New York. And the New Haveners thought, we could be part of this congregational colony, even though we don't want to be, or we could be part of this Episcopalian colony, which we don't want to be. So in 1664, they reluctantly joined Connecticut, but the deal was that they would share, that we'd have a co-capital system. So from 1664 to the 1870s, we had New Haven was the capital one year, and everybody'd go there and meet, and then the next year was Hartford, and everybody would go there and meet. So New Haven gets added because of the charter, but immediately we're going to have an argument as to what do all of these borders mean. All right, so we have a boundary dispute with Rhode Island. And the way it works is this, is Narragansett Bay would mean that Rhode Island would be what? Newport and, anyway, Fitzjohn Winthrop had been the person who had gone to England to get the charter from the king, because he was one of the few people in Connecticut. He actually knew people, wealthy people in England, and he knew how to grease the right palms and who to shake hands with and who to have tea with and how to get in to see the king. So one of the things that Winthrop received for his help was he was allowed to be governor, and back then the rule was you could only be governor 1 year at a time. And what we said to Winthrop is, if you do this, you could be governor just for as long as you want, and we don't care about term limits or anything like that. So at any rate, so Winthrop early on makes an agreement with the Rhode Islanders that rather than the Narragansett River, it would be the Pawcatuck River. And if you look at a map today where the Pawcatuck River comes out, this is called Little Narragansett Bay, and that was how they resolved the language of Narragansett Bay. They made it Little Narragansett Bay. Now, the Connecticut legislature didn't like the idea that here's this nice big chunk of land that we were losing that the king said was supposed to be ours. So the legislature repudiates this, and for years there are arguments. And so Rhode Island starts claiming parts of Connecticut. At one point they claimed all the way up to the Connecticut River, even though their charter very specifically said the Pawcatuck River. It got really ugly. At one point, a sheriff from Rhode Island was arresting people in Stonington for failure to pay their Rhode Island taxes, because it was claimed this was Rhode Island. At another point, there were people from Connecticut who renamed one of the Rhode Island towns because they thought it was a Connecticut town. So it's just, and taxes were always going to be a big issue on the border. So anyway, this goes back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. Then in 1696, the Board of Trade is created in England, and it's created because other than the 13 North American colonies, Canada at this time was about 4 colonies. There were about 10 or 11 colonies in the Caribbean. Every colony had a different charter, so the trade deals with each one was different. The taxes they had to pay was different. And the Board of Trade said, this is crazy. Let's revoke all of the charters. Let's just say all the colonies have to follow all of these rules, and that's all there is to it. And so that was kind of hanging over everyone's head. So as we started to complain in 1703, the Board of Trade says, you know, if Connecticut and Rhode Island can't get along, we'll just revoke your charters, and then we'll just tell you what you're supposed to do. That put everybody in line for a while. Then in the 1720s, when the argument broke out again, the Board of Trade said, you know what, how about we just join these 2 colonies to New Hampshire and make a super colony? And everybody in Connecticut and everybody in Rhode Island said, no, that's okay, I think we can figure this out. So about that time, they started to accept this idea of where the line is. So anyway, then the boundary with Massachusetts. This is where we start to get to the nuts. All right. In 1642, Massachusetts hired two surveyors, Nathaniel Woodward and Solomon Saffery, and they were hired to come out and survey where the line was supposed to be. Now, what they should have done is found the southernmost point of the Charles River and measured off 3 miles, and then kind of marched along straight along and drawn the line as they went. And there was swamps and mosquitoes and Native Americans and bears and all sorts of things that they didn't want to have to deal with. So they said, we have a better idea. So they sailed around Cape Cod, they sailed up the Connecticut River, and they got off about where they thought. They looked at the sun, they said, yeah, this is about where it ought to be, and they drew their line. And they didn't even draw it straight. You can see they kind of like this, right? So it's off between about 4 and 8 miles. The people in Connecticut complained. They said, that can't possibly be right. So what we did in 1665 is we hired some surveyors who actually went up and they figured out where it was supposed to be, and they drew what's called the true line, which is right here, which is actually the line that we use today, right? Now here's a good example of the way the towns are. You can see here's Westfield, which is now part of Massachusetts. Once upon a time, part of their territory was down here, right? Enfield, part of Enfield was up here, right? Woodstock came over the line a little bit. So when the towns were laid out, there was no standardization. So you might have been living in Connecticut one day and then realized you were really in Massachusetts the next. So anyway, so this is going to be an argument for a very, very long time. So in 1708, we appeal to England, and we say, this is just absolutely unfair. But again, we also have this concern for the charters. We don't want to push it too hard, because if it looks like we can't solve our own problems, our charters are gone, and with that, our whole control of our political process, right? So what Massachusetts does, they like collecting the taxes from these towns. So they say, okay, here's what we'll do. If you let us continue collecting taxes, we'll give you some land up in New Hampshire. And we said, well. So we accepted that for a while, but we continued to complain about it. In 1749, Woodstock, Somers, Enfield, and Suffield, they voted to join Connecticut, and the reason for that is our taxes were lower. Taxes are always going to be an issue. But you can see here that eventually Southwick is not going to agree to this. In 1768, though, Massachusetts restates their claims. So oddly enough, we're governing this area, but Massachusetts is taxing it. And it's not settled into 1800, which is, after the Revolution. It finally came down to all of these communities had voted, with the exception of our little notch here, had voted to be a part of Connecticut, so it was finally agreed that that would be settled. But it took a while. And then we had a boundary dispute with the Dutch. The Dutch are in New Amsterdam. The Dutch claim originally, they believe New Amsterdam extended all the way to the Connecticut River. And part of that claim was they had established their trading post at Hartford, and they said, very often if you had your citizens there, you could claim somebody from our community is there, so that's part of our community. So anyway, in 1650, we signed a treaty with the Dutch, and what the treaty said was that the actual boundary of New York would be 20 miles east of the Hudson, which would put it roughly about where it is today. So that was a treaty that we signed, and also as a part of that, we got part of Long Island. So the eastern part of Long Island, according to the Dutch at least, was technically ours. But in 1664, the English are going to seize New Amsterdam. And at this point, the line is going to, because we're Greenwich's, that whole 20-mile line, they started to adjust. They moved it out a little bit. Some of this doesn't fit easily into PowerPoint slides. Anyway, so in 1664, New York is given a charter. James, who's the Duke of York, he owns the colony. He makes us nervous because even though he's an Episcopalian, he's married to a Catholic woman, and there's a real concern that he might be a secret Catholic. And as a matter of fact, when he became king and he had a son who was Catholic, that's where we get the Glorious Revolution. He gets driven out, and William and Mary come in, and all of that. But at any rate, so when he takes Long Island, the first thing he does is he repudiates the 1650 treaty that says that the boundary is 20 miles. He says, no, New York should extend all the way to the Connecticut River. Now, about this time, the Rhode Islanders are claiming to the Connecticut River, and the New Yorkers are claiming to the Connecticut River, and technically Connecticut is just sort of some islands in the river, right? Anyway. But in 1683, an agreement is reached. We go back to that 20-mile line. But there's some problems, and the problem is that you have Greenwich and Stamford here, who that technically consider themselves part of Connecticut. So they came up with this solution, and that was again, you see there's 61,000 acres here. This is decided to be part of Connecticut, and I don't know if you can see it, but where this line, if you draw a line over here, you sort of have an oblong, like this space is equal to that space. It's not quite, which is why they moved this line back, right? So they said, okay, we'll move that line back. I think that's 1.5 miles or something, and then we'll cut this over. And so that'll perfectly work out so that these people that want to be Connecticuters can be Connecticuters, and New York will get all the land that they should have, and everyone will be happy. Except the people live, have you ever driven on 95 and you hit Rye, New York? That was settled by Connecticut people. They paid taxes to Connecticut. They thought they were part of Connecticut. And what this line says is, sorry, you're not part of Connecticut anymore. They were really upset, especially because the taxes in Connecticut were much lower. So that was a real big brouhaha. But again, they didn't have much to say about it. So now the thing I wonder is if you went to Rye, New York, if you could find one single person that knew their Connecticut heritage or knew the story at all. Anyway, that's...
So these two odd shapes to Connecticut are because the towns that are in those shapes claimed they wanted to be one or the other state. So Southwick wanted to be Massachusetts, right, and remained Massachusetts.
They did, yes.
And those two wanted to be Connecticut and remain Connecticut. And so they accommodated these three towns. Yes,
exactly. Yeah, Stamford, if you remember, that was part of the New Haven colony to begin with, and then Greenwich was settled by people actually from Stratford and from Haddam. So, yeah, and again, religion has a lot to do with it because these are people, they consider themselves good congregational Connecticut people, and they didn't want much to do with the Church of England, which would be the Episcopalians here. Yeah, so at any rate, yeah, and here you can see that 1664 line that was originally drawn that would have included part of Rye. So it's, I don't know. I still get confused when I read about this and I look at the maps and I try to figure out where did the line go and who was complaining about what.
And those two surveyors that took the easy way up the river,
yes,
and then drew the diagonal line or crooked, not even line.
Right.
Were they on foot surveying, or how did they do that odd line that wasn't straight? Did they traipse from Hartford?
I don't think they did much walking. I think what they got there and they looked at it and then they just sort of drew. I don't think they walked along and surveyed the line as much as I think they surveyed part of it, then they extended it. You know what I mean? Like you could draw part of a straight line and then say, okay, it would extend this way and that way. So.
And then the true line.
That was really surveyed. That was that we
instruments and foot.
Yes, they got out there and they used the instruments, and that's why the line is perfectly straight. Yeah, yeah. All right, and then we get the Dominion of New England again. James II, when he becomes king, he thinks that it's going to be easier to administer his colonies if there are fewer of them. So he creates what's known as the Dominion of New England, which is going to extend from Delaware Bay to Penobscot Bay. So this is from 1686 to 1689. He creates this super colony with the capital in Boston. It's supposed to streamline the management. The governor is Edmund Andros, who had been the colonial governor of New York and also a good friend of King James. So Andros, he has the job of collecting the charters. So he goes around and he goes to Plymouth and collects their charter. He goes to Massachusetts Bay and collects their charter. And he comes to Connecticut to collect our charter, and we don't want to give it to him. So he had already, about 10 years earlier, there had been, with the boundary dispute, he had showed up in Saybrook with soldiers in order to enforce the king's order. And the Connecticut militia, they just happened to be practicing there, and the British soldiers were outnumbered. So Andros wisely got on a ship and he sailed away. So he didn't like people in Connecticut anyway. Now, when the king's emissary shows up and tells you to do something, you're supposed to do it, because if you don't, that's treason. All right, so here comes the king's emissary. He's going to collect our charter. We don't particularly want to give it up. So as the story goes, when he showed up, they had a big celebration. They said, welcome, and they said, here you go, and they had a dinner, and they sat down, and they had speeches, and it started to get late, and it got dark, and they lit the candles, right? And the charter's sitting there right on the table, and everyone's talking about how glorious the king is, and how great Andros is, and how wonderful the people of Connecticut are, and how everybody loves each other, and we're very happy to hand over the charter. And then someone opens the window, and the candles blow out. And they scramble around, and when they light the candles, the charter's not on the table. And everybody goes, oh my goodness, someone stole our charter. So what is Andros supposed to do? Even if he figures this is a trick, which it was, can he arrest everyone when everyone is claiming to be as upset as he is? So supposedly, was it Jeremiah Wadsworth? Rolled the charter. Now the charter, again, it's big pieces. It's pretty big. He rolls it up and he runs down the street to his house and he sticks it in a dead branch of an oak tree, and it sits there for 3 years. Now, you don't want to have the charter in your house, because if they come looking for the charter and they find it, they're going to find the nearest tree and you're going to be hanged for treason, right? So nobody wants to have possession of this. So it's supposedly, this is the story or the myth or whatever, it's hidden in this oak tree. Now, every time I go to look at the charter, and I've seen it a lot, I try to imagine that for 3 years it was out there getting rained on, and snow and hot weather and cold weather and squirrels chewing holes, and even if it was wrapped up, it's hard for me to imagine that's really what happened. But we don't have any way of knowing that it didn't happen. But anyway, that's where we get the story of the charter oak. The tree blew down in 1857 in a hurricane, and they cut it all up, and they made furniture, they made clocks, they made clothespins out of it. Supposedly, if you took all the stuff that was supposedly made from the charter oak and put it back together, the tree'd be about 900 feet tall, because there's a lot of fakes going on out there. But one person who was really involved in it was Samuel Colt. He was a big businessman at the time, and he had a chairmate and other things. So there's some stuff that we know that the Athenaeum has, especially that came from the Colt family, that really came from the charter. And also, when you look at the charter itself, there's the top of it has a wooden frame, and that's made from the charter oak. So that's pretty cool. Anyway, so the charters are supposed to be surrendered. We don't surrender our charter, which means we're able to hold on to it. But at the same time, we are concerned here in Connecticut, because by the 1680s, most of Connecticut is settled and this area isn't. And we've also had this argument with New York as to where is the boundary going to be. And there's a real concern that in all of this problem, that we might lose control of this area that we consider ours. So it's decided that we need to settle it. We need to make some decisions in terms of it. So in 1686, right in the middle of this, it's decided that they're going to take the western lands, which is this section here, and they're going to give it to the people of either Hartford or Windsor. in part because they felt like they were constrained by their settlements. But Windsor's constrained by the line here, and Hartford's kind of in the middle of Windsor and Wethersfield. So the land that become these 4 towns, or 5 towns, 6 towns, are given to Hartford and Windsor. And in 1626, these towns are actually established, but the land had already been given to the people. So some of these are Hartford towns. New Hartford is a Hartford town. Hartland is a Hartford town. Winchester is a Windsor town. Barkhamsted is a Windsor town, as is Colebrook. That's only 5. And the 6th one is Harwinton. Harwinton is split. Can you see where the name comes from? It's Hartford. It's a Hartford Windsor town. Yeah. Okay. All right. And then the other land there, what they do is they sell it off. But at any rate, the reason that you see, this isn't really settled till much later, and we don't really see settlement until the Revolution. It's really the 1760s. I have some of my ancestors were some of the first people that moved up there. It was like the 1760s. So it took a really long time for people to move up there. Farmland wasn't that good. They did discover there's iron ore deposits there. Some of the best iron ore deposits in the colonies are up there. And during the Revolution, we were making cannon and chains and ship's anchors and things like that. Anyway, part of this whole boundary issue becomes the settlement of that northern region. So here's Connecticut in 1766, 6 counties. There are no cities. The first 5 cities were established or designated in 1784. You see the notch still hasn't been settled. So that kind of looks like us, but we weren't satisfied. For one thing, we had some territory up here in, New Hampshire. It was actually in Vermont, because New Hampshire claimed Vermont. We owned some territory up here that Massachusetts had supposedly given us from that agreement as to who was going to monitor the towns here and who's going to collect taxes and all of that. It's also claimed by New York. And New York said, well, if our charter once upon a time said the Connecticut River, then that must be ours, even though Massachusetts and Connecticut had taken their territory. In New Hampshire, of course, they thought that all of that should be theirs. So there were lots of people from Connecticut moving up to what they called New Connecticut, right? So for a while, people thought this was going to be a part of Connecticut. Now, it's sort of odd to think that maybe there'd be a county up here that would be part of Connecticut that wouldn't be contiguous with Connecticut, because we generally think of, Michigan's the only place I can think of where you have the lake and you have upper Michigan and all of that, and maybe the Hawaiian Islands, but that's kind of different. So at any rate, but there are people moving up there. One of them was Ethan Allen. Do we know Ethan Allen? Not the furniture guy, but the Ethan Allen, the American Revolutionary hero. Yeah, okay. I always have to tell my kids that, okay. Eventually, though, we sold the land that we claimed up there, and we put the money into our education fund, which at that time went to Yale University, because we all know Yale University needs more money, right? Yeah, anyway. Still, the people from Connecticut who lived up there, they continued to live. They didn't come back, so they just became eventually Vermonters. All right, and then we get the Susquehanna Company, because you remember our charter goes all the way to the South Sea? We decided that must be Connecticut out there, right? So actually in 1754, there was a group of Connecticut investors. They purchased land from the Iroquois out here. Now the Iroquois lands, if we had a map, kind of covered like this area here. All right, so the Iroquois sold some land to the Connecticuters. A few years later, they sold the same land to some Pennsylvanians, which leads to struggles, right? I don't know if the Iroquois just saw them coming and said, we'll sell it to anybody that wants to give us money, or if it's their understanding of land ownership and that, there's a lot of issues that could be going on there, but at any rate, it becomes confusing. So there were this Susquehanna Company, they raised 2,000 pounds, which was a heck of a lot of money back then, 738 investors, again, hoping to get rich. So in 1769, they settle out here. The Susquehanna River is right here, but it's the Wyoming Valley. When I was a kid, I always thought, well, how are the people in Connecticut all the way out there in Wyoming? But it's the Wyoming River. It's the Wyoming Valley of the Susquehanna River. So you have Connecticuters moving out there. They established 5 townships, and the original settlers, I think there's 40 settlers in each township, and then more and more people move out. They make arrangements to build 3 more, and they call it Susquehanna County. And if you look at the map of Pennsylvania today, right here is Susquehanna County. And again, the problem is that they called them Pennamites at the time, because Pennsylvanian sounds kind of strange. Pennsylvanians. Anyway, so they're Pennamites, and they just called the Connecticut people Yankees. So when they have a war, it's called the Yankee-Pennamite War. Anyway, so the Pennamites own the same land, so there's going to be a real struggle here. This is actually a fort that was built by the Connecticuters. It was called the 40 Fort. I think it's on the 40-mile mark or something. So the first Yankee-Pennamite War is between 1769 and 1771. 2 people were killed. So it wasn't really, it was just... Yeah, it was... Both sides thought they were at war, but there wasn't a whole lot going on. Now, in 1771, we petitioned to George III, and George III said, yes, your charter extends that far. That is your land. So Connecticut's claim is approved. The Pennamites were not impressed at all. So we get the Susquehanna County in 1774, they're sending delegates to the Connecticut legislature. So you got people meeting in Hartford from all over Connecticut, and then you got about 8 people coming from the towns here, right? And again, it's very hard for us to think about a piece of Connecticut out there 200 miles away, which back then, travel back then, it would take you months to get there. Oh yeah, there aren't any roads. Yeah, it was. I would think it would take you 6 weeks on horseback at least. So you got to really want to get to Hartford and participate. Yeah. At any rate, we then get the Second Pennamite War, which nobody was killed in. But the problem is, in upper Pennsylvania, there's a large group of loyalists, and there's also the Iroquois Indians who, in spite of selling the land off, didn't really like the settlers. So the most bloodshed that comes out of this is for the Pennamites and the Yankee settlers who are actually fighting this battle where I think about 40 people were killed. And eventually, after the war, obviously the Iroquois, well, they're pushed back and the loyalists are gone, and then after the war in 1782, the Continental Congress overturns Connecticut's claim. They say that's ridiculous, that's Pennsylvania, because if you think about that map, we were claiming 1/3 of Pennsylvania, right? Yeah, if you figure Connecticut's this big, and then that was pretty large. So. And then there were the western lands, because let's face it, our land, this is Ohio, right? Our claim would go all the way out to Ohio and Indiana and Illinois and Iowa and Nebraska and on and on and on and on. Okay, so after the Revolution, there were conflicting claims here. New York had a claim to some of the land. Virginia had a claim to some of the land. So Congress decided what they wanted to do was extinguish everyone's claims so that they could open the territory for settlement. So The Articles of Confederation, which are our first constitution, they were written in 1777. It took 4 years for the 13 colonies to ratify them, and one of the sticking points was the Western land claims, because nobody wanted to sign on to a document that said we're losing claims to land, which is really, really valuable. So the states finally agreed to sign on here when it was agreed that if they ended up giving up any territory, they'd be paid in some way, or land would be given to their veterans from the war. So that was kind of the agreement. And if you can see here, for example, the Virginia 10 is the Virginia Military District. So Virginia, they thought that their boundary went this way. So Virginia actually gave up a large piece of land here, which was supposed to be reserved for Virginia military veterans. So that's anyway. And so because the land claims are extinguished in 1784, Congress passes the Northwest Ordinance, which opens up not just Ohio, but Michigan and Indiana and Illinois and Wisconsin and Minnesota east of the Mississippi to settlement, right? All righty. So then here we have the Western Reserve in 1786. We gave most of our Western lands to Congress. That would be all that other stuff. We retained a small section of it, though. We kept 3.2 million acres south of Lake Erie and 120 miles west of Pennsylvania. This is about 5,000 square miles. How big is Connecticut? About 5,000 square miles. That's a lot of land. You know, sometimes when you look at the map in Northern Ohio, you say, yeah, it's a few towns, and it was pretty good size. Okay. So then there's a company, it's called the Connecticut Land Company. Most of this land is sold to the Connecticut Land Company. They got $1.2 million at 6%. It was supposed to be paid in 2 years. Now, I'm pretty sure back then $1.2 million was probably like $1 billion, like a lot of money. The idea that you and I as investors could make a promise to pay. It seems unfathomable to me that much money existed for people. But anyway, so
6% was a good return, wasn't it?
Oh yeah, it was fabulous. Yes, it was quite good. But see, here's what the investors hoped. The investors hoped that everyone would say, wow, that's a great investment. You paid $100 for your share. I'll give you $200. So everybody was hoping that it would sort of spiral and everybody would say land is a good investment. And it didn't really happen. In large part because it's not until, I think 10 years later that there was a treaty signed with the Native Americans. It was actually safe to move out there, and it was another 10 years before people actually started to do it. So anyway, the Connecticut Land Company hires Moses Cleveland to go out and help to lay out the communities there in northeastern Ohio. Do we know Moses at all? Do we know the community that he established? Yeah, they named the community for him, and about 5 years later, the map maker was writing Cleveland, and he left the A out. And we know history's not fair, so it's not. It's now. So, and when you say Moses Cleveland, you think, oh yeah, that's kind of like the city of Cleveland. Well, it is the guy that helped lay out the original city of Cleveland. Anyway, so part of the Firelands. Which was about 500,000 acres of this. It was 3.2 million acres. About 500,000 acres was reserved. It was called Firelands, or the Sufferers' Lands. During the Revolution, people had lost property to British raids. The Sufferers' Lands. So the British had attacked at various times. New London and Groton. New London had been almost burned to the ground. I think 141 buildings were destroyed. Groton about 40. Parts of New Haven were burned. Parts of Fairfield, Greenwich, Danbury suffered great losses. So if you had lost territory or buildings to the British during the war, and it was mostly burned down, which is why they call it the Firelands. The state of Connecticut would grant you land out here. Now, because it took so long to settle out there, what happened is most of the people who had claims didn't settle out there. It was children, and in some cases even grandchildren, who eventually moved out there to settle. But if you go out there, you find towns like Farmington and Avon. There's actually a New Haven out there, which they don't call New Haven, they call it New Haven. And I try to correct them, but I figure what do they know, right? So anyway, so this was our last claim to that extended area, and this really, in a way, it extinguishes the claims of our original charter, but it also, there are lots of people living in Ohio that have Connecticut roots. There are lots of people living in Pennsylvania that have Connecticut roots. Lots of people living in Vermont that have Connecticut roots, as well as people that kept moving west. You know, there's. What's that? Southern Canada. Southern Canada too, sure, yeah. I was doing some genealogical research a while ago and met someone who knew someone who knew someone. I got an email from a woman who lives in Washington State, and she and I are like 275th cousins or something, because both our ancestors both came from the same town in Connecticut. And so anyway, so that's and I think for the first time ever, how are we doing for time here?
An hour, almost two.
Yeah, it's before 2. It's less than an hour.
And I kept taking out slides saying this, I'll never get through all this stuff in time. All right, okay. So anyway, this is Connecticut today with our real notch, and here's our 8 counties, right? So do we have any questions?
When did that charter surface? If it's in the tree and then the tree blows down, when did they find it?
In 1689, James II was defeated, and he left England, and William and Mary came in to be the new king and queen of England. At that point, the whole charter business blew over. The Dominion of New England was dissolved, and we magically found our charter. So yeah, it was only hidden for 3 years. But we were lucky to keep our charter, because after that, when Massachusetts Bay got a new charter, Plymouth was added in. So Plymouth lost their rights as well. So the fact that we were able to maintain it was extremely important, because we felt that we had a very strong sense that the laws we had passed under the charter made the civic community that was Connecticut. As a matter of fact, when we got to during the Revolution, when the Declaration of Independence was written, Congress told all of the colonies, "You're no longer colonies; you're now states." So all of the charters you have from the king, throw them away, and write new constitutions. And 11 of the 13 colonies wrote new constitutions. We didn't, and Rhode Island didn't. And the reason we didn't is we said that, as far as we were concerned, the charter wasn't the basis of our government. It was all the laws we had passed under the charter. So we didn't write a new constitution until 1818. So, but yeah, the charter was only missing for 3 years, assuming that it was missing at all and it wasn't sitting in someone's house somewhere. Any more questions? Or?
Very good. Thank you for that.
All right. Well, this is good.
Funding for Simsbury Community Television is provided in part by contributions from viewers like you. Thank you.